In his treatise on war, the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz wrote in the 19th century that war is merely the continuation of politics with other means. But this tidy quote ignores the real cost of those means. As conflicts arise between political entities over resources, with one side wanting what the other has, believing that it has the right and is justified in taking it, that the military action is acting for the good. And conflict arises over perceived threats, preemptive strikes, we say today, or over one side's treatment of others and the other's feeling an obligation to intervene, that is, war in defense of some group or some cause. When violence falls upon a region in the form of war, it unleashes a wave of brutality that lands so disproportionately on those not actually fighting, who become either direct victims of the conflict, killed, wounded, enslaved, or indirect victims due to the war's disruption of economic and agricultural systems upon which the population relies. War is a calamity. How does one make sense of this disorder? Many have done so by viewing the conflict as a just cause, a moral effort, against forces of opposition that stand opposed to the moral and decent and right thing to do. The filter used to assess the conflict may change over time and circumstances, whether in the form of nationalism or a political ideology or a religious conviction. But whatever the lens, the result is to justify the fight on those lines and to position the opponent as the epitome of evil, as the combatants become human agents in a cosmic battle between good and evil. Such sentiments are well rooted in history and connect directly with our pre-modern wisdom traditions. In this video, we touch on the justification of warfare that emerged in two branches of the Abrahamic faith, Christianity and Islam, in the era of the Crusades that reached its zenith in the period around 1100 to 1300, when our course comes to an end. So let's start with Islam. Now recall that Muhammad was the only religious leader in our course's wisdom traditions that was both a spiritual and a community leader. He led the Ummah, the community, that was comprised initially of those migrants who had fled persecution in Mecca and the supporters at Medina. The Ummah was threatened by hostility from the Meccans and had to defend itself. And we find revelations in the Quran urging the faithful to cast out unbelievers from Mecca, the unbelievers who had driven the faithful from the Kaaba, the sacred shrine at Mecca. And then after the death of Muhammad, the caliphs launched decades of conquests against the Persian and Roman empires, transforming these regions into a dramatically new cultural and political entity. As this new world took shape, so did the Islamic doctrine of war against unbelievers, which arrived at a standard interpretation around the year 800. And this was jihad, a term that means striving, and one whose connotation is not limited to war, but can refer to a deeper struggle to purify oneself, purging unsavory and sinful practices. But here, it meant warfare in the path of God, and it linked with an idea of martyrdom, that those who die fighting in the path of God will be well provided in heaven. And religious scholars continued to develop the idea in the following centuries, articulating a leader's duty, the distribution of spoils, and the treatment of non-Muslims. These scholars did not all share the same perspective, and they expressed differing views on the obligations of jihad, some limiting it in scope to a defensive obligation, and then others who called for Islamic sovereignty wherever possible, making, as they said, and I quote, the religion of truth prevail over all other religions. They divided the world into two parts, the abode of Islam, the Dar al-Islam, on the one side, where there was proper order and where Sharia was supreme, and then there was the abode of war, the Dar al-Harb, on the other. And some scholars even viewed war against dissident groups within the Dar al-Islam as jihad to ensure a just and ideal society. Let's now shift to the Christian side of the conflict. Unlike Muhammad, recall that Jesus did not face the experience of leading and defending a community of believers. So the formulation of a Christian theory of war had to wait until the Christians were in a position of political power in the Roman world. When they were in power, wars continued, just as they had been fought before, but now they had to be justified on Christian grounds. In the 5th century, Bishop Augustine of Hippo began the articulation of a Christian theory of just war, and this greatly influenced Western ideas of the just war. And war was justified if, he explained, it was authorized by a legitimate ruler, it was done for a just cause, and it was done with the right intention. So you couldn't wage a war out of revenge or greed, for example. Now, in these early centuries, Christian leaders generally maintained a sense that war carried with it a sinful element and penance was needed after all the killing was done. But that legacy completely gave way. By the 9th century, we find the Bishop of Rome declaring that Christian soldiers who died fighting non-Christians would gain eternal life. And in the 10th and 11th centuries, bishops of Rome led armies. In the 11th century, a millennium after the death of Jesus, a clear notion of holy war crystallized among Western Christians. And it did so in an era when Western Christianity was expanding its territorial outreach. Christian forces pushed south against Muslims in Spain, advanced in Sicily and North Africa, and then it turned east. In the late 11th century, the Bishop of Rome, Pope Urban II, called for Christian knights to conquer, or as he put it, liberate Eastern Christians and the Holy Land, which had at that point been in Muslim control for more than 450 years. Now, this call united the concept of holy war and pilgrimage. And pilgrimage in Western Christianity was an act of penance, where one atones for sins. And making a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to the footsteps of Jesus, was viewed as the highest form of pilgrimage. The term crusade and crusader did not then exist, and the knights were referred to simply as pilgrims, making an armed pilgrimage to the holy city of Jerusalem. Knights were called to take the cross and began the pilgrimage of a conquest. And so the two forms of holy war came to blows. The political context of the First Crusade involves a Seljuk Turkish expansion, a Byzantine defeat, a Byzantine emperor's appeal to the West for mercenary, and Pope Urban's utilization of this situation to assert his prominence in the West. The Pope was the legitimate authority to call for war, which was waged against Muslims in the First and Second and Third and Fifth Crusades, with Jews often falling victim before the Crusaders even left Europe. And the Crusaders attacked Orthodox Christians of the Byzantine Empire in the Fourth Crusade, sacking Christian Constantinople in 1204. They were also launched against dissident religions in France in the Albigensian Crusade in the 13th century, and against pagans of Eastern Europe also in the 13th century. This Christian holy war expanded Western control and condemned the very existence of the enemies with whom it fought. Today, for many in the West, the term crusade has been sanitized and used to combat social ills like a crusade against poverty, while jihad is often emphasized by believers in its personal and social dimension. But the legacy of the historical dimension of these terms remains, rooted in notions of community-sanctioned violence against others who are deemed the enemies of God.